I'm going to focus a bit more on the ecological aspect of Hong Kong's foodway instead of the more recent means the last few decades, focusing on the migrants' food after the Second World War. The reason is I've been working on food culture or foodways, as you can call them, for a while, and then quite often people come to ask, what is the food culture in Hong Kong? And I think it's a little bit difficult to just summarize it in a few lines. So recently I come up with a package, like, okay, Hong Kong's foodways probably will have three very major components. The first component is a more ecological because of our locations. And then the second one is more about Hong Kong as a trading hub, that we can get different kind of ingredients to Hong Kong and we turn it into our food. And the third part will be more like all the kind of new food which came to Hong Kong after the Second World War through the migrants' influence. So, so today I would like to, well, if you are interested, later I can talk about the second and the third components. Like the second components mostly, I will use examples of the Shanwan, Lam Bak Hong area, that you can see all different kind of goodies coming to Hong Kong. Either they are from the south or they are from the north, from Southeast Asia or different part of China. They come to Hong Kong and make Hong Kong as a trading hub for all these kind of food. And most of them are actually dry fruit. They are dry fish, dry scallop, abalone, or dry nuts, mushrooms, and all these kind of things. Because of the trade, so it makes Hong Kong very unique, and also make our food becomes our food culture become very unique. The third part is mostly talking about the migrants' issues. And when we talk about Hong Kong, and yes, Hong Kong was a colony for 150 years, but actually the serious migrants' issues only happens after the 1949, and there's more Chinese people coming to Hong Kong after the so-called liberation, and then so it creates lots of different kind of synergy on cooking. Right? My first research on Chinese on food culture in Hong Kong is actually about the Hakka restaurants, which that is brought by the Hakka people to Hong Kong and make it become very kind of common food. And then so later on there are more Shanghai, Sichuan, and then Western. And even though when we talk about Western food in Hong Kong, the Saichan, then actually they have two roots. One is from Guangzhou, a little bit earlier, maybe in the 20s or in the 30s. So there are still some of them still quite common in Hong Kong. And then there's another trains of Western food coming to Hong Kong, actually is from Shanghai in the 50s. And those are, we call it like lo song tong or lo si, kind of Russian dishes. Those are the Western food which was very localized in Shanghai, and then they was brought to Hong Kong after the Second World War. And then later on, of course, we have more nouvelle cuisines, fusion, all different kinds of like mixtures of the Chinese and so-called Western food. So those are the two components. But today I try to focus on the first one. It's more about the ecological aspect. Hong Kong locates at the lower basins of the Pearl River Delta area. And so we share some common ecological characters as the Shanghai area, because Shanghai area or Jiangsu area was also at the outlet of the Yangtze River, of the Changjiang, and then so we shared a bit common. So we both of us call ourselves is the place of rice and fish, and in Chinese is 魚米之鄉. So we are 魚米之鄉, and then they are also 魚米之鄉. But they have a little bit more because their weather allows them to grow two crops in 1 year, one rice and one wheat. But in Hong Kong, we have two rice, two crops, and most of them are rice. Both of them are rice. And then we also share the characters of having lots of freshwater fish. As you know, one of the very expensive Shanghai dish is called xi yu, steamed fish with some like yellow wine, and that is a freshwater fish and very seasonal. And then as the same characters, we have all different kind of freshwater fish from in this area. In this area, yeah, because this is the lower basins of the Pearl River Delta. So in the old days, Hong Kong people like to eat a lot of freshwater fish, glass carp, mud carp, snakehead, some kind of catfish, different kind of catfish, and all these are very common fish in this area. So these are traditional dish. In fact, we don't eat a lot of galupa or the seawater marine fish in the old days. So let me call a very old food cultivate in this area, which is oyster. Oyster. Do you know where we cultivate oyster in Hong Kong? Hong Kong has a long history of oyster cultivation, and the oyster we cultivate in Hong Kong is a Pacific oyster, and we call it the gigas, which is the same kind of oyster that you have in Hiroshima, probably in Japan, in Australia, in New Zealand, and those are the Pacific oyster, which is more like greasy, comparing to the European one. Is smaller, thinner, and fatter. And in Hong Kong, this is the area we used to cultivate, and then we are still cultivating a lot of oyster in this area. But a couple of decades ago, they realized that even though we are cultivating this called the gigas, the Pacific oyster, but actually the one in Hong Kong is a very unique one. It's a little bit different from the major gigas. So they name it as Hongsinus, Hongtisinus. Usually once you find something in China, though you put it like Sinensis or something, so it's just Hong Kongnensis, something like that. So this is the oyster we have in the Deep Bay. We don't know exactly the history of oyster cultivations, and some people mention that that must be like a few hundred years old. And in the old days, they like to collect the oyster fry in this area. And I don't know whether you are familiar with oyster cultivations. Oyster lay eggs when the weather was relatively warm, and also they want certain degrees of salinity. So the water should be a bit salty rather than too fresh. So usually by in the summertime, or before the summertime, they like to lay eggs. And so the old traditions of oyster fry collections is they put some kinds of blocks, wooden blocks, and then on the surface of the water. So once the small oyster get to that, they stick on the block, and then they keep growing. So this is how they collect it. And then once they lay eggs, then in the old days, they like to move the oyster to this area. Now is the international airport, and used to be called Sajiang. So from time to time, if you go to like a dry marine products store to buy oyster, they will tell you this is Sajiang Hou, Sajiang oyster. But now Sajiang doesn't produce any more oyster. Just the name is still there, and in this area, there are lots of places that produce oyster, even though the other sides in like Macau. So this is the whole area. And why this area is good for oyster? Because it has interesting ecological systems. Even though you can see this is all like a sea, but because of the rain collect in the summertime, the rain collect in the inlands and will flow into the river during the summertime. It collect and then go out. So during the summertime, the water here is relatively fresh instead of very salty. And to have the oyster in a fresh water can make them grow faster and more meaty, right? That's why, but they don't lay eggs. They grow, they don't lay eggs. So before they bring it to this freshwater area, they let them lay eggs and collect all the oyster fries in this area. And after they lay eggs, they bring it to this upper river area and then let it grow for another 4 to 6 months. And then harvest by the end of this year, of the year. And that's why usually we have a lot of good oyster. So either the kind of soft one or fresh one or the dry one. And by the end of the Chinese New Year. And interestingly, in Hong Kong, especially in South China, if you go to a Chinese family on the first day of the Chinese New Year, they like the traditional way is to eat vegetarians, right? But if you dig into this vegetarian dish, you realize that there's something it's supposed not be there, and those are the dry oyster. And then I ask my students, why we have dry oyster in our vegetarian dish? I said, do you think it's strange? And now students have a very modern way of thinking. They think, well, because vegetable is very plain, so you need to have some dry marine seafood to like enhance the taste. Well, that's correct. That is the traditional aspects of the kind of MGS, the chemical that make your food more tasty, especially dry oyster. So, or even you want oyster sauce, right? But of course, everything has a story. And then I asked around and about why we put dry oyster in our vegetarian dish. I got two typical answers. The one answer is because in the old days, people think they plant the seeds, the oyster seeds, for the oyster. So it was categorized not as an animal, but as a plant, because they call it the seed, the oyster seed. And the second explanation was they think there's a myth about the old Buddha. The Buddha was very hungry, so he stick his pole on the mud, and then for a while the oyster stick on the pole, and then he pull it out, and then he eat the oyster. So as far as Buddha can eat the oyster, so we can eat oyster. So that is the two explanations. You might want one or the others, but this is sorry. But practically, it's true that if you have a dinner or you have a supper with Chinese, Southern Chinese, especially Cantonese, on the first day of the Chinese New Year, they emphasize that they have to eat vegetables. They're vegetarians on the day because, well, in anthropology, it's very easy to understand. Because by the end of the year, we have a feast. We celebrate that we have a good ending, and then we need to go through a transitional period. So the first day in Chinese New Year, we have a lot of taboo, and we also have a lot of rituals. We have taboos. We don't wash our hairs in old days. We don't like whip our floors because we would like throw away all the good luck. And then also we need to be quiet. We don't go to visit friends, but we stay home and then have a nice vegetarian dish. Until the second day, and that is in Hong Kong we call it Hoi Lin. And that is the time we eat all the food which is supposed to be bought by the end of the new year and then kept fresh. So you have a chicken, you have a meat, you have a fish, or you have some other like delicacy for that. So that's a transitional period. We eat we are vegetarian, but we have oyster. So probably that is a very special traditions in South China, and we cannot tell when we had that kind of traditions. But anyway, I think there's interesting aspects. But back to the oyster cultivations. Nowadays, as you can see, the international airport is here, so that means we don't have any more Sajang oyster. And most of the oyster cultivated in the inner deep bays are a little bit kind of outside, probably in this area. If you go across a bridge and go to China now, from the bridge upstairs, you can see a lot of like hanging raft for oyster cultivations. And most of them are on the Hong Kong side instead of the Shenzhen side, because they owned by the Hong Kong farmers. And I asked them, well, if they don't make use of the current or the salinities of the water to make good oyster, is it still working well? And then they told me, yes, because the water in the summertime will still be fresh because there are more rains. If you don't have rains in that summer, then I think the oyster might be very like skinny. Okay, so as far as we have enough rains, so to dilute the water, and then before they can pour in a little bit inside to collect the oyster seed. So these kind of traditions of oyster farming are still working quite well there. So this is part of these changes of our like food cultivation based on the ecological systems. And also, I would like to talk another items which is also a very common items in Hong Kong is the grey mullet. In Chinese, it's called wu tao. Right? Have you ever eaten wu tao, the grey mullet? Okay? In Hong Kong, the qualities of the wu tao is based on if they have any oil on the back under the skin. Right? Because people believe that in the old days, they feed the wu tao, the grey mullet, with the peanut residues after like getting the peanut oil. So these peanut residues is very good for the fish, and it's very oily. So they collect, and then when you steam the fish, this very tasty oil will add on the fish with a special kind of flavor. But grey mullet was never a kind of fish in the polyculture system in South China. The polyculture aquaculture system in South China is mostly a composition of glass carp. In Chinese, it's called wan yu, and then zhak yu, another kind of carp, and then mud carp, and then lang yu is mud carp, and then catfish. Tilapia, which was introduced like 100 years ago from Africa, and then snakehead. The polyculture system worked quite well in South China because you can consider the fish pond as 3 layers. The glass carp on the top, they like to eat grass, so that's what they got the name. But this is a big fish with a very tiny stomach, so they mostly cannot digest everything. So they get out something, and then the second layers the second layers in the fish ponds, they are mostly the mud carp, the lang yu, and the zhak yu, and other kinds of the carp. They eat the leftover, and then to the bottom, we need some cleaners. These are the catfish, snakehead, and or some kinds of dark carp, we call it. So they are the cleaner at the bottom. So it's a good cycle for 3 layers of fish within one fish pond. So gray mullet was never one of them. Until the 60s, that because of the embargo in Hong Kong, between China and Hong Kong, so we don't, in Hong Kong, fishermen do not receive or cannot buy enough fish fries from China. And the technology there at that time was not that advanced that they can breed their own fish and create the fish fries. So what can they do? I mean, they don't have fish fries, so they cannot survive. I mean, as a business. So some of these farmers realize that they can collect the fish fries from the sea, because gray mullet is a very interesting fish. They live in Pacific Ocean. They live in the Pacific, and they move to the north for a while, and then will come back to the south every year. And in the winter time, well, they don't want to. They like the migratory birds, right? They go to the north in the summertime, and then they will come back to the south in the winter time. And then most of them arrive Hong Kong area in the Chinese calendar. We call it Xiu Han, which is around December, probably a little bit after the Christmas time. Before they arrive Hong Kong, actually they pass by Taiwan, and Taiwan people love gray mullet. But that is a time when they are not starting laying eggs. So they still hold a lot of eggs, and the Taiwan people catch them, they only take the eggs. And that is a delicacy that Taiwan produced quite a lot for the Japanese market in the old day, and then they call it the wu yu ji, or in Japanese it's called karasumi. And it's a tiny pear, salt and sun-dried, and then they slice it and then eat it. I think in Europe, there are similar things, especially in Spain, that you slice these small fish rolls and then eat with some salad or vegetables and create a very nice flavor. So before they came to Hong Kong, they hold the eggs, and then Taiwan people like to get it and then make it as this kind of delicacy. But if they can escape from the Taiwanese hands, they come to Hong Kong and start laying eggs on the coastal area of Hong Kong. And then the fishermen, starting from the 60s, they realized that gray mullet is the only kind of mullet which they can adapt moving from the sea into the freshwater fish pond very nicely. Probably I think I'm the first one who documents how they catch fish fries from the sea and then put them in the fish ponds. And then very interesting, this old couple, they are just bringing their net, a thread net, and then they are walking, and then they hold a long bamboo stick with a plastic bag on the top. And then once they see a group of fish fries, so they hold the net on this side, and then use the bamboo stick, touch the water on the other side. So once you touch the water, or make some kind of shaking, all the small fish fries, they would come this direction, and then two of them would just catch them easily. So that's the way they catch fish fries on the coast. And then usually I think this couple is one of the few family in Hong Kong who are still collecting fish fries, and they need about 100,000 fish fries for their fish ponds, right? So they start doing that in the winter, slightly after the Christmas time, and then and until the middle of the Chinese New Year, the first month of Chinese New Year. So this is mostly the 1 to 1.5 month time that they can collect fish fries to put into their fish ponds for their whole year's cultivation. They told me, wow, it's better to do that because they believe that the wild one is stronger and then they grow better. And also they can save a little bit money, because the fish fries, if they have to buy fish fries from Taiwan or China, it's quite costly. It's about $1 per fish fries. So if you are interested later, I can tell you how to calculate the cost of raising fish. But then this kind of technique was actually really invented by the local fishermen because of the situations. At that time, when there's an embargo, when they realize that Hong Kong's population is growing, we have higher demands of food. So in the 60s and 70s, actually the Hong Kong local freshwater fish farmers provide a lot of, I cannot say a lot, but it's a high proportion, high percentage of fish for the local populations. At the same time, now we are talking about, okay, this side, right? The oyster is from here, we put it to this area, and then harvest by the end of the year. And then the fish fries is mostly from this side. The Pacific, they come to this area. I follow them to Sai Kung area, to all these kind of beaches to collect fish fries. A very interesting experience. And then there's another area that produce good food is this area. Not only the oyster, but we have good the shrimp from the brackish area. But the shrimp, the cultivation of shrimp was actually a kind of side product of the local cultivations. Starting from the beginning of the last century, people are cultivating rice in this area. And the very famous area is Tin Shui Wei. And that is a rice area. So they collect water. You know, when you have to raise rice, the rice paddy needs a lot of water in the beginning. So they have to block the water in order to keep the water for the rice. And then, but they don't want to waste the land. So in the old days, the upper sides of these river, they can block the water to raise the white rice, and then the lower part of the river is a little bit salty. So, but they can still raise a kind of red rice, which can be cultivated in the brackish area. But the brackish area is not very consistent, the salinity. If you let fresh water go into the brackish area, the water become very fresh, and then it's not good for the red rice. But if you don't let water go in and just keep seawater coming in, they become too salty, and it's not good for the red rice. And that's why the local people invent a gateway system to control the water, the water salinities between the inside river water and the outside seawater. So from time to time they change the water, and because of the tide, they change the water and get more, keep more fresh water from time to time, or they just have to release the fresh water and bring the seawater in. Because of doing that for a long time, and until they realize that they have another kind of side products, because the fish fries and the shrimp fries growed in the mangrove area, came in with the water, and then grow in this, we call it a gateway, in the gate area. This area has a very low yield in terms of productions, because the red rice do not grow as high as the white rice. So has a low, they only make a low income. But then they realize that the side products is much more, give them a much better returns in terms of money. So they start changing, giving up the red rice, because the red rice was not very popular in Hong Kong. So they changed the whole gateway into a shrimp cultivation area. Until the 70s or 80s, then when Hong Kong's food demand is growing, then they even changed the gateway into fish ponds. But because of some conservation people, and especially I would say the bird watcher, they want to keep the ecological characters. So they make a suggestions to the government, why don't they keep some of the gateway for conservation. So now we have this Maibo Reserve area, was actually a very good conservation movement starting from the 80s to keep those gateway area instead of let them change into fish ponds. And So that was very interesting development from rice to shrimp, and then some of the fish ponds some of the shrimp gateway was turned into fish pond in those areas. And of course, as you know, some of the fish pond was even turned into residential area or parking lot in Tin Shui Wai area. So this is a whole area. And then given these are few examples of oyster, shrimp, and fish. In fact, we can see how local farmers make use of their knowledge and experience to turn this area with a special ecological characters into a very rich farming area. And however, we don't really see how people treasured it. And either shrimp, I don't think you can find any gateway shrimp in the Hong Kong market now. And most of the shrimp you find here was probably from China, because the production of gateway shrimp is very low. And I think the only available place is the Maipo Reserve area. And I don't think I think there's a deal between them and the farmers that they don't want to send the shrimp to the market because it will affect, in the old days, will affect the farmers' profits. And then even gray mullet, and every year we have less and less fish ponds, and not only because people don't like it, eating less freshwater fish, but because of the aging of the fishing communities. A lot of the fish farmers I know, they are over 80s. A very active one who's working in this area, he's like 85 this year, but he's still working. And then when we asked him, what are you going to do? I mean, are you going to pass your knowledge or your experience to the younger generation? And he's just look at us and say, well, who want to learn it? And so he can only get some helpers from China. Those helpers are people with experience in freshwater cultivation, but they are not really able to attract younger generation in Hong Kong to inherit this kind of knowledge. And recently I'm meeting some oyster farmers. They also have their own problems. They say now that the technique of oyster cultivation is much advanced because they are not using the mud, how to say, they call it ground type. They're using the hanging rough, so they can grow more for the local. But because the some kind of bad image of the Lau Fau San oyster, people, because in the 70s it was highly contaminated, polluted. So people still have this kind of image and do not really want to eat a lot of oyster. Even though it seems there's a different association have been doing testing on the water and the oyster in this area. That's pretty safe, but people still have a kind of bias, prefer to buy the Canadian oyster, the American oyster, or even pay a lot of money to get the European one, rather than to try our own like Lau Fau San oyster. So I think some of the fishermen, the association is working very hard to promote them and also to get the public to understand not only those are good food, but actually those are the oyster cultivation has a lot of history and a lot of like culture behind. So I think maybe I just let you briefly understand that these few cultivation items, which is closely related to our ecological characters in Hong Kong. And then if you have more questions, and then I'm more than happy to share with you something I know about this area. Thank you.